This is an interview with Rose Roberts, wife of Henry Roberts, Tony Oklahoma on October the 2nd, 1972. The interview is still with Bish, is in Oklahoma. Rose?
And that's where I met the football players. And that's where I met Henry Roberts, who later became my husband in 1912. And we had 4 nice children, 2 boys and 2 girls. My oldest daughter works in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She works for the BIA and teaches music. And my son works, one of my boys works at Santa Fe at the Art Institute. They're all doing good. And my youngest daughter's here taking care of us. And we are getting pretty old now. We don't do much of anything. We just kind of sit around and watch TV. And I guess that's about all. Jim never did like to dress up. He always went around looking so raggedy. He had an old, long, raggedy coat he always wore. And old, raggedy shoes. But he was always happy. So that's the way he went around, didn't he? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The way he went around. He wasn't no sport.
He didn't try to show off.
No, he didn't try to show off, no.
Far from that.
Yeah, his old coat was just torn on one side.
Yeah, not wicked or anything like that.
Yeah, and he was good to everybody. He was just a jolly good fella, you know. Mm-hmm. He danced with all the girls, you know. He didn't favor anybody.
Treat them all alike.
Treat them all alike. That's the way he was. Mm-hmm. The way we knew him. That was Jim Thorpe.
You would say he never had the big head then.
But that's why I don't know how he ever met Iva. How did he ever meet Iva? He didn't go with her, Carlisle, not when we was there. He must have had a quick romance, you know. Overnight romance.
I guess they all came from the other side, from Iva.
But I know one thing. I remember Iva. He had so many write-ups, you know. I know one time I saw her. She had a great big book, some kind of a great big catalog or something. And she was saving all his clippings, you know. Oh, she had a lot of clippings.
She must have
idolized him or something, because she was just putting those clippings. She had pages and pages of his clippings, you know, football clippings. I remember I saw that.
He was married?
That's before she before she ever even went with him. She never went with him.
Yeah.
But I remember I saw that. I saw her with all those clippings she was saving of Jim Thorpe. I guess maybe she thought, well, someday I'm going to get him.
Maybe so.
Maybe
she finally talked him into it.
But at that time, you know, she wasn't. He didn't even. I don't think he even thought about her.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So he was that kind of guy. He wasn't so interested in girls.
Wasn't tied up with any.
No.
Good. Treat them all alike.
He treated them all alike. Yeah, that's the way he was. Mm-hmm.
Okay, is there anything else before we finish it off here that you'd like to say?
Well, maybe Henry has something to say.
No, I guess I said I could sit here all day and relate things, but too much.
I still think he ought to write a book of his life story. I think that's been interesting, don't you think so?
I think so.
Because he has a life story.
10 years
from the time he was just a little boy up to now, even up to now.
I couldn't sit down and write it out now myself. I used to type, you know, and all that. I can't do that anymore. Maybe you could find someone to dictate it to.
Well, Edith types, you know. She's a businesswoman. She knows that. She looks after all his business down.
It would have to be to write a book of your life.
It would have to be some, I would call an expert that's expert on those things and propound the question just in order, maybe chronologically or near so. That what the beginning right down to present, to relate
Yeah.
the things of your life,
In the beginning, I think he was born in a tepee. See?
I guess I was.
Yeah.
My dad,
Over here near Skedee.
my dad tells me
Yeah.
that.
No doctor either.
Of course, my father, he was a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Lived out on the farm northeast here, but near the river. We had a dwelling, a regular dwelling like this, and I think one of the rooms, however, must have been the oldest part, was built out of log house, log room, and the other was, I guess it got lumber later on, added on to it. That's where we lived, but when I was born, that was in the early days. I don't think this town here was
even
much
here.
of a town or even here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my mother was soon to be confined, and my father said he had to bring my mother from the farm there to a place over here about near this little town of Skedee here, out about a couple of miles. There must have been a settlement of Pawnee Indians there. Back in those days, they lived kind of in settlements, They maybe tents, so on in the summertime especially. They'd be all kind of close together. And I guess there was a midwife that lived amongst them in that settlement there. Mm-hmm. And my dad knew about it, so I guess he had planned beforehand to bring my mother there so that I could be delivered there. That's where I was delivered.
Yeah.
Right there, I suppose it must have been in the tepee, as she says.
Yeah.
No doctors.
Yeah.
No white doctors those days, Of course, they had Indian doctors, but I don't know whether in delivering a child like that, whether they'd be of any help or not. I doubt it. Usually the midwife looked after that.
Yeah.
That's the way I was delivered. That's when I was born. Then I guess, I don't know how soon, I was taken back to home. Maybe I had to stay there a while, Then I guess I was transported to our home there, and I survived somehow under very crude condition, you might say. Very crude.
And then he lost his mother when he was only about 8 years old.
Oh, yeah.
And from then on, he was just everywhere.
I might say I was halfway orphaned.
Yeah, he was orphaned. Never knew what it was to have a mother.
I
Wasn't
think
that
that's
sad? That was sad.
I think that's one reason why my dad, I had a half brother. We were almost same age. He was born in February, I was born March, same year. We were paired together. He took us, because his mother was living it, but my mother had passed on that fall, previous, the following spring in March. My dad took us to Lawrence, Kansas. I was 8 years old then. My brother, half-brother, had just come 9 years old. He was born in February and I was born in March. Entered us there at high school as young lads. Of course, those days, they took young kids. I guess lots of them probably were orphans or halfway orphans like we were. A little bit of kids. I think we had kids there as young as 5 and 6 years old, actually. Mm-hmm. They had to be taken care of. They had their sort of I know on our side, they had what they call the small boys side and large boys side over this other way. They had their own buildings. And us little boys, we had to have sort of what you might call a godmother. And it was the duty of that woman to kind of keep watch over us, especially at night. About time for retirement at night, where she'd come to our dormitory. We had a big dormitory, us kids in there. She'd come there to administer our deeds, wants, like maybe a lot of the kids would have some itch or something wrong with them, you know. It was her duty to take care of us, you know. And then I think she had to be able to counsel with us, talk with us, or, you know, visit with us. She'd talk with us and make it home-like as much as possible, which I thought was all right. And she'd come every evening to bring her salves, different things, you know, and look after us and see that we got into bed at the right time, and then she'd leave. That's the way it was. I think a lot of those children were orphans or halfway orphans. That's how they come to be sent there. Of course, my dad, he was left with 5 or 6 children when my mother died, you know. But
And his dad had more than one wife, see? He had more than one wife.
You know, see, my half-brother,
Yeah.
my half-brother, he had 2 wives right at that same time, my mother and my brother's mother. And speaking of our family tree, that'd be quite a thing.
Yeah.
Because of plural marriages those days. I had a grandfather, and he came from Nebraska. He was quite old, I guess, but he came from the state of Nebraska upon the removal of the Pawnee tribe from Nebraska to Oklahoma. He came here. I don't even know him. I don't know when he died, but he received a piece of land here right north of town, and my brother was on it. And he had several wives, that man. I don't know how many. Consequently, he had a host of children. Some of them were, of course, half brother and half sister to each other. So you might say our family tree is pretty large. If we were to check into it.
They were all related to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a big family tree, you know, because of those. He might have had about 4 wives at one time.
Yeah.
And I just had children from all of them. And some of them were half to each other, half brother, half sister. Now, just from my mother alone, I think he had 6 children when she passed away. My sister lives in this house here. Her mother, I believe, I'm not so positive, I never did inquire about my father. I think Vivian's mother was the full sister to my mother. They were known as the Howell family, Howell people. Those names were assigned. I don't know how the names were assigned or from whom assigned. Just like my father, his name was Roberts, Rush Roberts. Well, that's strictly an English name, you know. The only way I can conjecture on that is that when the Pawnees were still in Nebraska, well, the government sent white teachers and instructors among the tribes, among them being the Pawnee tribe, to try and educate the Indian people in the arts of trade and so on, and establish schools, you know, primarily for the youth. But then even the grown-ups were not educated, school educated, you know, for that matter. But I guess for the older ones, they tried to teach them in the trades and vocations and the farming and such as that, trying to get them to where they could be kind of self-supporting. And what I was going to say, to do that, well, the federal government had to send mostly white instructors amongst the Indian tribes. I think some Quakers, I think they were pretty strong in the early days in coming out amongst the Indian people. There were some Quakers, I think, came amongst the Pawnees in Nebraska. And of course, Roberts, wouldn't that be a
French, I believe. Or what?
English.
English?
No, English. There is Roberts in English.
Roberts? R-O-B-O-T-S.
Scotch, too. Scotch.
I thought that'd be Scotch or something
Yeah.
like that.
Maybe.
You think, well, speaking of Quakers now, I guess Quakers in the East those days represented most any kind of people in it. Or were they,
Yes, I think they're mostly English.
well, that's, yeah. Well, I think Quakers got amongst the Pawnees, and in some other tribes, French got in amongst them. And like that, you know.
Yes.
And her people, well, the
They're all
French got
French.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, my grandfather was a Frenchman
French?
from Canada.
French got into their
Yeah.
tribes. There were northern tribes around the Great Lakes and up in that area, northeast, all up in there. Probably came out of Canada or somewhere up in there. See that town of Quebec, Montreal, those are French cities, you know.
But see,
Well,
my grandfather married a full-blood Indian woman.
yeah.
That's how my father was half Indian then. So.
Well, that's what I say. I don't know just how my dad got his name. There's no record of it. Just how he got it. Might have been a school instructor, or one of the instructors there amongst the Pawnees and teaching a vocation of some kind. You know.
Well, Lena said out in Arizona when she worked out there amongst the Navajo Indians, they said they'd bring those kids in, you know, from reservation, you know, they'd bring them into school and they'd say, they didn't have no name, only Indian name. And then they'd say, what are we going to name this one? Let's give him Henry Ford. Let's name him Henry Ford. Yeah, that's the way they named them, she said.
Well,
See how they got their names?
They just thought of a name.
She said she heard them do that.
But it's a funny thing now. With the Pawnee tribe, as different from some other Indian tribes, most of them have English names of some kind. Although they had their own Indian names. But now some other tribes here, like for instance the Ponkas up here, they maintain their Indian name. Most of them, they all had Indian names. Like my dad, he had Indian. They maintain their Indian names and it is translated into the English, like running after arrow. See, in Indian way, his name was running after arrow, and translated into the English, and he was allotted that way and enrolled that way on the tribe. That's what happened with some of the tribes, predominantly. But the Pawnees, they all seem to have been assigned English names when they were allotted their lands here on this. Used to be a reservation, so their allotments are designated by the English name, or well, I guess you call it English name, and yet they still had Indian name too. Well, now, like my dad, well, he had, my dad served as an Indian scout one time. He drew a pension for his service. I didn't relate that here. He was, when they had that uprising, you know, that their Sitting Bull up to the northwest. It was in those campaigns. The Pawnees, having lived in the state of Nebraska for a good many years, well, there were two brothers. I don't know whether they were Quakers or not, but they must have been military men or something. They were called the North Brothers. I got a book on that, the whole history of it. The North Brothers, they were white men, Frank North and Luther North. Seemed like somehow they got well acquainted with the Pawnee people while they were in Nebraska. I don't know in what, through business or what it was. But they were well acquainted with them, and the Pawnees knew them well. Well, when the Pawnees were moved down here from Nebraska, during the years from 1874 to 1876, they concluded the removal to Oklahoma. Well, I don't know what it was that what they call a Custer massacre occurred. It was soon after that. Anyway, the North brothers must have been known. They might have been members of the army. You see, back in those days, the army was much in control of everything in this country. Anyway, Custer got killed up there by the Sioux and Cheyenne, I think. That created quite an uprising. Well, they were trying to run down this Sitting Bull and his gang. And I guess the War Department, got in touch with these North brothers in Nebraska. Instructed them to come to Pawnee. I guess it is known that the Pawnees had been moved from Nebraska down here and told them to come here and to muster in some of the men. They were to serve in the cavalry. Because they were issued horses, saddles, and everything. They were to help run down those renegades up there, so-called renegades up there. And these North brothers came down here, right here. This agency used to be over here. And I guess they were allowed to muster in. Must have been orders from the army with the sanction, I suppose, of the Indian Department. Well, a lot of these Pawnees were anxious to serve, I understand. More anxious to volunteer than what they could take. I think the North brothers must had instructions to muster in about 300. And they had more than that, right? See, the Pawnee tribe was bigger those days, too. They had enough for that and then some more. They had to be turned down. When my dad got in, but I think he must have been about the youngest one. I think he must have been about 16 or 17. And they took him, mustered him in. He told me about what went on up in their campaigns. And those North brothers were the ones that took him up there. And of course, when they were mustered out, well, they came back to home, of course. I think the federal government let them maintain, they had issued them uniforms. They let them keep their uniforms. Now, I think they let them keep their horse and the saddle, and possibly the gun. Everything that they had been issued, they were allowed to keep, bring home, And then years went on. In the meantime, a lot of those old fellas passed away. Some of them were getting quite old. They died here, passed away. But I don't know how old my dad was, but there came a time, I forget the year now, when the federal government, Congress I guess, passed a law allowing a pension to these survivors, those that survived yet. My dad having been the youngest, he was still living. And he got in on that pension. He drew pensions for a good many years. He lived to be 98 years old, and past 98. And he drew pension for a good many years for his service up there.
He lived right here and died here.
Yeah. There were two men that brought the Pawnees from Nebraska down here, I understand. They were two brothers. They called them Burgess brothers. Would that be Quaker? I think they're supposed to be Quakers from Pennsylvania or somewhere. Their name was Burgess. I've seen both of them. I saw them in Chicago years later. Oh, that is long after. They were getting old then, but I saw them. And those men could still talk Pawnee, some Pawnee language. They talked with these. I was up there with some elderly Pawnee. We were on our way from here to Washington, D.C. on some tribal business for the tribe, and went by way of Chicago. I think one of the members at Station Medlock,
Yeah.
he knew that the Burgesses lived up there and he wanted to visit them, so they routed us through Chicago. We stopped over there while we visited. He located them and they were there. They visited these old timers because they knew them, you know. They talked Pawnee. Now you see, that's just one thing that I can relate to you about the way back there.
Yeah, I still think he should have written a book about his life. To tell a lot of stuff.
Burgesses, I guess.
Way back there.
That's great.
Yeah. See, he's got a good mind yet, you know, but you know, he's gonna lose that one of these days.
Well, we better get it all down then.
Better. You know who we can contact?
I wish I wish I was related. You had some way you could just jot that down some way.
Yeah.
It's got to
I
be,
bet somebody would be glad to write a book of his life story.
Take
'Cause
time.
he's had a good life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Take time. And
Well.
those Burgesses are gone now. And one of them, by the way, I found out after we met him there in Chicago, he was a spiritualist. And you know, I was a young fella yet. I wasn't so old. The other fellas that I was with were older than me. I don't know how old I was.